The strange simplicity of English, from the field's edge. English is, at heart, a simple language. You don't have to bend verbs to fit genders. You don't need to remember whether a chair is masculine, feminine, or some mystical neuter. We just say, the chair, and that's that. But in that simplicity lies a trap, because English, for all its plainness, is a maze. It borrows freely, hoards words like a magpie, twists meaning with tone, and hides complexity beneath ease. It began, crudely, gutturally, with the Anglo-Saxons. Their speech was not so far from Dutch, from German, and if you hear Old English aloud today, you'd barely recognise it as kin to the language you're hearing now. Then came the Norsemen, Vikings with sharp steel and sharper tongues. They gave us words like sky, knife, and egg. They stripped grammar down like bark peeled from a tree. And then the Normans came, speaking French, ruling England, reshaping her speech. For centuries, French was the language of law and crown. To be English was to speak both with your mouth and your manners. And so, English changed. Again. It became a language of layers. Germanic bones, Latin flesh, Norse blood, French perfume, a mongrel tongue. And perhaps that's why it endured. Because it could shift, it could bend, it could absorb. When England grew into empire, it brought its language with it. On ships, in ledgers, on lips of missionaries and merchants. It was not always offered with kindness, but it was planted deeply. And now, centuries on, we find ourselves in a strange place. The world speaks English, on signs, in business, in films, in protest and poetry alike. And yet, many of us who speak it fluently barely understand where it came from, or what it cost others to carry it. It is a simple language, but it is not innocent. It is a flexible language, but sometimes, in its dominance, it deafens us. And so, I think it's worth asking, is English truly ours anymore? Or is it a river that ran through us, and now floods the world? And then there are the words themselves. Old words, turned inside out. Prestigious, for example. Now it means honoured, respected. A word often wheeled out by the media as if it places a thing beyond reproach. But the original meaning? It meant illusion, conjuring, a trick of light and suggestion. To call something prestigious once meant it fooled you well. And perhaps it still does. How many other words have been turned this way? Where power is dressed in praise and manipulation made respectable. Reform used to mean a return to something sound. Now it often means privatization. Transparency is promised most by those with the darkest corridors. Truth itself is now a brand, debated, redefined, reframed daily. It's as though our language has become a battlefield, where the meanings are no longer fixed, just convenient. The establishment knows this. The media knows this. And too often, so do we. But we carry on speaking their tongue because it's the only one we've been given. But language is more than speech. It's memory. It's history. Buried in the soil. It's the hush between hedgerows. The turn of phrase your grandfather used that no one says anymore. It's how we carry the past into the present. And sometimes how the past warns us, quietly, that we are being fooled again. English is not sacred, but it is powerful, and we owe it to ourselves to remember what its words once meant before they were scrubbed clean and sold back to us. So, the next time you hear a word like prestigious, pause and ask, does it speak truth? Or has it simply learned how to dress the trick in finer clothes? Of course, there are those who go further, much further. They'll tell you English is a black magic language, that words themselves are spells, and writing is sorcery in disguise. They point to schoolrooms. You learn to spell, they say with a knowing look, as if that single syllable unlocks ancient secrets. But the word spell has always had two meanings. To conjure, yes, but also to piece things together, letter by letter, to give structure to sound, to help children speak clearly and understand one another. And yet, some will say that every contract, every title deed, every name in capital letters is part of a dark linguistic trap, as if misfortune stems not from policy, greed, or power, but from phonics. I find that idea, frankly, prestigious, but it speaks to something deeper, I suppose, a yearning for meaning in a world that feels increasingly hollow. If language is broken, then perhaps nothing we signed, said, or suffered was ever real. It offers comfort of a kind, but I think the true spell, the one cast most often and most effectively, is not the alphabet. It's distraction. It's the constant noise that keeps us from asking simple questions. It's words twisted just enough to sound true, but hollow enough to carry no weight. Prestigious. Reform. Freedom. Used not to clarify, but to close the door on doubt. And so I sit here, at the field's edge, watching the sun fold into the hills, and I wonder, what would it sound like if we spoke only the words we meant? What would English become if it were used not to obscure, but to reveal? Not to spellbind, but to set free? Maybe that's all language ever needed. A bit of stillness. A quiet space where words don't perform, but rest. Where truth isn't a headline, but the sound of a name said gently. Where freedom isn't promised, but lived in small acts of kindness. Where home isn't defined by a flag, but by a voice calling you in from the wind. English doesn't have to be a maze. It can be a path, not grand, not prestigious, just honest. Like an old word remembered in the right moment, or the right silence kept when there's nothing more to say. And maybe, from the field's edge, that's the kind of language worth speaking.